2 Samuel chapter 6. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, that was 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal-Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, or sometimes called the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, which is called by the name, the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. They placed the Ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. And so they brought it with the Ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of instruments made of fir wood, with lyres, harps, tamarines, castanets, cymbals. But when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, for the ox nearly upset it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. And David became very angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And so David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" And David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And it was told King David, saying, "Well, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God." David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so it was that when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling, and David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod, and so David and all the house of Israel will bring up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. Verse 17, they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Let's pray together. Lord, I'd ask that today you'd help us to understand about yourself, more of yourself, and Lord, our response would be to worship you with a full heart and a whole heart. And Lord, give us understanding of how you work in this world, for we pray it in Christ's name. Amen. We're going to deal with the central aspect of the text in 2 Samuel chapter 6 about God and Uzzah. But I want to set the table, do some introductory work for us in order to understand what's going on here. One of the challenges of our times with regards to our faith and Christianity is the charge or the argument against God in that God is immoral. One of the classic arguments for the existence of God, there's teleological and cosmological and ontological rational arguments for the existence of God. One of those arguments is called the moral argument. Ravi Zacharias follows the moral argument of God. If you listen to Ravi, he's essentially outlining this particular idea. Now, he doesn't always express it this way, but the moral argument of God is very compelling for Ravi Zacharias. But the argument for the existence of God, the moral argument, essentially has 2 premises and thus a conclusion. The first premise is if there are objectively binding moral obligations, then God exists. If there are objective, binding moral obligations, then God exists. There must be something greater than ourselves to cause that. Second, there are objectively binding moral obligations. There are moral obligations that we would say everybody must adhere to. Therefore, if those two are true, the third premise is, therefore God exists. If there are objectively binding moral obligations, then God exists. Premise 2, there are morally objective binding obligations. Conclusion, therefore God must exist. But we live in times where that's called into question. Is God a moral being? Is God capable of being a moral being? And so understand that even what we just sang is cause for objections to the morality of God. Okay? The mystery of the cross I cannot comprehend, the agonies of Calvary. You, the perfect Holy One, crushed your Son. Now, the term that people will apply to that may be something like this: cosmic child abuse. You should think about it. God, a loving Father, crushes His own Son. What kind of God does that? What do you call that when in our society? Don't you call that a child abuse? And certainly child abuse is not moral. Child abuse is immoral. A person who commits child abuse is guilty of immorality. So we just sang that God is an immoral being, didn't we? Judging by today's terms. You know, the class that is called the New Atheists, and in some of the contemporary challenges to Christianity, will argue that even if there is a God, who wants to have anything to do with him if he's like what the Bible describes? One of these new atheists who's passed away a few years ago was a gentleman by the name of Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens is an English journalist. He actually wrote as a columnist for Vogue magazine, but Hitchens was very articulate and compelling in his arguments, and often was involved in debates with Christianity on the existence of God. And really, that's his big argument. It's not scientific. His argument is primarily moral. I watched this week this dialogue that took place involving a Catholic bishop and Christopher Hitchens. And when the bishop was done, Hitchens stands up, and essentially what Hitchens does is berate the Catholic Church using the arguments and the words of the bishop. Because what he says is essentially this: I'm so thankful that you have admitted, that the church has admitted to genocide, Inquisition, Crusades, the abuse of children, what happened in Boston, what happened with the Holocaust, and the church has had to ask for some kind of forgiveness. And he takes all of these things and he says, you, as the representative of God, the representative of Christ, are saying that what you're doing at the time is carrying out the will of God. Well, then what does that say about God? These acts are immoral. Everybody agrees that they're immoral. You even agree that they're immoral. You have to ask for forgiveness. Therefore, God is immoral. Therefore, we don't want anything to do with him. Way to go. Really, that speaks to the age. It's really a contradiction of our times in many ways, because the people of the age want the right to absolutely pass judgment on the morality of God, to say in absolute terms, this is moral, this is not moral, while at the very same time denying the absolute of morality. They want to deny others the right to pass judgment on their morality, while at the same time exercise the right to pass judgment on the morality of God. Timothy Keller, who many of you have read some of his works, the pastor of Redeemer Church in Manhattan. In his work, Making Sense of God, he calls this a moral schizophrenia. There are no moral absolutes, therefore I can do as I please, and you can't judge me. And yet, God, you are guilty of immorality. The virtue of the age is tolerance, but tolerance has boundaries. Tolerance must have boundaries. You can't tolerate everything, right? Must have boundaries that are defined by a morality that's relative. By a morality that is not absolute, doesn't have boundaries. It's totally subjective. Back in the middle of June, Timothy Keller was invited to address the British UK Parliament prayer breakfast. Kind of an unusual place for a rebel to be, but he was invited to come and make an address at their prayer breakfast, similarly to the prayer breakfasts that are held in Washington, D.C. And the premise of his presentation was essentially this: let Christianity be Christianity. Let Christianity be Christianity. God has said that, look, we're the salt of the earth. And for salt to be effective in fulfilling its purpose, in exercising its properties, it has to be different, a different agent than that which it is interacting with. It has to be different. If it's not different, then those properties don't get to exercise or fulfill the purpose of salt. And so he said, look, the church is salt. Therefore, let the church be different as it interacts with our culture and our society. And in arguing that, he said, look, you look back through the past and you say, what has Christianity brought to bear upon Western civilization that would make it continue to be relevant into the 21st century? And essentially what he argues is this, and it's along the line of this schizophrenia. He says, when Christianity was birthed, when Christianity came into the world, it entered into a culture that was an honor-shame culture. An honor-shame culture where the reason you don't do something, or the reason that you do something, and some kind of moral act, is for your personal honor or your personal shame. And he uses the term self-directed, that everything is directed back to you as a self, the person. Honor, shame. When Christianity entered into that culture, he said it brought a different ethic. It brought an other-directed ethic called love. That Christianity introduced, if I use that term, love into a culture that was self-directed, now saying, no, it is other-directed, and certainly based upon the gospel of Christ, which is other-directed. Isn't that what we sang about? This is what Christ did for us. This is how Christ loved us, other-directed. Christ emptied himself. He gave himself. How do we respond to others? We give ourselves to others. We sacrifice for others. He said the problem that we have in contemporary society is this, that the message that we proclaim and we repeat over and over and over again to those coming up in younger generations or to others is that you must be self-fulfilled. You must love yourself. You must be self-actualized. You must be self. What we preach and what we communicate and what we advocate is a self-directed ethic. And yet at the very same time, what we say to them, but we expect you to sacrifice. Expect you to give yourselves for people. And so he said, people trying to figure out, well, which is it? Self or others? He said, let Christianity be Christianity, because in Christianity, there you see the other-directed life. Christianity follows a love ethic that is defined by the person and the work of Christ. We'll get to 2 Samuel. Hang in there. So if you're interacting with others who begin to challenge the moral integrity of God, what essentially they are doing is passing judgment on God using the ethic of love that is detached from any boundaries, any absolutes. You'll hear people say that, well, why should I do it? Well, I love to love people. It's all about love. Love is all you need, right? What the world needs now is love. Love, love, love. Okay. The problem is they want a love that has no definition. That love is unhinged from a definition and left merely to a subjective description. So I get to describe what I think is an act of love. Love is not bound to a law or a definition or a boundary, because there are no laws or boundaries. Let me give you this illustration. Some of you may employ a certain kind of discipline with your child. Okay? My dad did too. Okay? On more than one occasion. And he would say to me, I love you. And then I'd cry. And it was hard to imagine at the time that that was an act of love. But he's reinforcing that he loves me. And my guess is that's what you do too. If you're employing that method of discipline, you're saying, this is because I love you. It's an act of love. I want you to learn. I want you to do right. I want you to... It's loving. Try employing that act of discipline in the middle of the grocery store. You see, now others will describe that not as an act of love, but an act of abuse. So love, the world says we want to love, but we have no definition of it because it is absent from any boundary or any law. The problem is love without a law, love without a definition, love without boundaries is moral anarchy. Everybody gets to describe what they think is an act of love. For Christianity, the law of love for us, we'd say, is the law of Christ. We operate with love following the law of Christ. And thus many Christians included, and certainly writers, scholars, philosophers often will then take love. I mean, love certainly is the greatest, right? That's what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now abide these three, faith, hope, love. But love is the greatest because love never fails. So therefore, love becomes the most important ethic, the organizing ethic for Christianity, the central ethic in relationship to God and in relationship to the world. So there are many who would make that argument. If you read Christian ethics books, that's what they will sometimes focus in on. I'm not so sure that love is indeed the organizing ethic that helps give definition to even love. I would argue that I think holiness is that organizing ethic, that central, controlling ethic that is revealed in the Scriptures. Now, having said that, let me give some clarity to that. What we are not saying is that God is more holy than he is loving. Okay? You cannot say God is more holy than loving. Why not? Because God is perfect. Therefore, all his attributes are perfected. He is perfect in his love, perfect in his grace, perfect in his righteousness, perfect in his mercy, perfect in his holiness. You can't have more holy, more love. It's like saying this. This is more unique, or this is very unique. You can't do that. The word unique in and of itself, okay, specifies alone. So you can't be more unique if you're already unique. Okay? God cannot be more of any attribute than his attributes, of any of his attributes. So he's not more loving or more holy. His love is perfect even as his holiness. But God's attributes are not independent. If I say God's love is not free, by that I mean not subject to any other of God's attributes. Not influence. None of God's attributes come to bear on it. That's not true. None of God's attributes are free from the other attributes. God's love still has boundaries given by his holiness and his righteousness. And I think that the attribute of God that seems to be the organizing central ethic for the display of God's attributes is his holiness. Not that it's greater than, but it seems to have that influence that comes to bear on his attributes. So, for example, in Isaiah chapter 6, you're familiar with that, when Isaiah has his vision, and part of that vision are the angels that are worshiping God, and they're singing a song, and that song essentially says what? Holy, holy, holy. Thrice holy. That is very unique. Never mind. Okay. Let me see if you're awake. See? All right. That is unique in terms of the attributes of God. You don't see that given to other attributes of God. You don't see it as love, 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 mercy, mercy, mercy. But you do see it with regards to his holiness. And throughout the Scriptures, you find this attribute seemingly at the center. Now, our first instinct is to attach morality to that meaning of holiness, morally pure. And certainly, God is, without sin, God is morally pure. And when you come to some of the passages primarily in the law, what you find there in the law, which is a code of ethics, a code of morality that God is given for how they're to live in relationship to God and one another as they enter the land. It's their code. At the heart of that, you see in multiple times this idea of God is holy. But is that just speaking to this moral idea of purity? I don't think so. So stick something in 2 Samuel. We're coming back to it. And turn to one example in Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11. We're again in the giving of this law, this moral code, legal code, ethical code. You find this, verse 44, and this is just one of many illustrations in the book of Leviticus. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You be holy, for I am holy. Consecrate yourselves. And that really carries this idea of what holiness is. Holiness, if you'll allow me to say, the concept of holiness is otherness. Otherness. The word holy means to cut. It means to separate. It means to be apart. Separate from. And so, for example, vessels, things that you'll see, well, this is a holy vessel. There's nothing morally superior or inferior about that vessel. It means that vessel is set apart. It's separated for a particular usage. Holy, therefore, carries the idea of otherness. A passage that I've told you often that is worth underlining, worth meditating on, to no surprise, is Isaiah 57, verse 15. Thus says the high and exalted one, whose name is holy. His name is holy. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean, well, my name is Wayne. God's name is holy. Is that what it means? No. It means his name is set apart. It's separate. There's something about that name that speaks to his character. So I asked Kevin in the first hour, he said, if you walked into a Jewish synagogue today and you said, hey, we're here to worship Yahweh, what would their response be? It wouldn't be embracing, because for a Jew, you do not utter the name of the Lord. You don't speak it. It is the other name. It is the transcendent name of God. Back in 2 Samuel chapter 6, okay, the ark of God is called by the name. the very name of the Lord of hosts. Represents his otherness. What you often find attached to that, both there in Leviticus 11 and in many others, is this idea where it simply says, I am the Lord. When God is speaking that, what he's saying is, I am the other. I'm not the profane. I'm not that which is the common. Again, in Isaiah, he says, I am the Lord, there is no other. No other. It's kind of redundant. I'm the Lord. It speaks to God's otherness. So when it came to the law of Israel, what God is saying to the people of Israel, I'm other, you be other, in comparison, in contrast to the nations. You're not like them. You represent me as being other. Love, as a Christian ethic, is a sacred love. That is, it is not merely other, it is a love that is derived from the source of love, who is wholly other. Certainly his love is other-directed, but the source of that love is the other, himself. So, to pass moral judgment on God is to profane God, is to bring God into the common. It denies his otherness, his holiness. It is to bring a holy God into the realm and domain of my thinking, my world, my thoughts, my reason, my argument. But God's actions, because God is holy, must be interpreted in the light of his holiness, his otherness. That the moral integrity of God is organized around his holiness, not his love. So, when I come back to 2 Samuel chapter 6, what appears here is, look, the ark, and I know it's hard to think of the ark of God, the ark of the covenant, without thinking of Indiana Jones, okay? Okay, and people ask, where do you think the ark is? Well, it's in a warehouse somewhere in Washington, D.C. Okay? And man, if you look at it, you're going to melt. The ark was a box. And back in 1 Samuel, chapters 4, 5, and 6, what had happened was the people of Israel got into thinking that the box was some kind of charm. Now, the ark represented the convergence of God's transcendence and his immanence. It was the place where the other dwelt among his people. Okay? God, the other, transcendent, now comes, dwells above the Ark of the Covenant to remind his people that he is present with them. Well, they carry it into battle, and the Philistines capture it. Eli falls off his stone, breaks his neck, and they say, look, the name Ichabod is birthed. It says the glory has departed because they carried off the dwelling glory of God. Well, when they take it to the land of the Philistines, bad things start to happen. They put it in their temple. And all of a sudden, the Philistine gods start to fall over and break and all kinds. So one city says, you know what? We love you, our fellow Philistines who live in this city so much, we're going to give you a present. And they pass it around. Okay? And finally, it's such a scourge on the Philistines, they say, look, take it back. And so 1 Samuel chapter 6 has it going back to the house of Abinadab. And even there, okay, some people, in 1 Samuel 6, it says how they handled it, and they looked in the box, and the text in 1 Samuel 6 says that 50,070 people died. Now, without going into great detail, let me just say that probably is a copyist error. Okay? And that most conservatives look at that and say, no, probably it's about 70. So at least 70 people died. Now David says it's time to bring the ark into the house of David, to the city of David, back to Jerusalem. And so they set about to do that. The problem is, God had given some very specific rules regarding how to treat that ark that represented his otherness. It wasn't like other things. And so it was never to be carried on an ox cart, for example. It had rings that were attached to the side that the Levites would slide those poles through those rings and then lift it up so that it was never touched. So it was to be carried on poles, not to be touched. It was supposed to have been covered, some very specific instructions to how it was to be covered. It was to be carried by a particular family of Levites. And so God in Numbers chapter 4, Numbers chapter 7, Exodus chapter 25, in the law had given very specific directions for how this box representing this convergence of his otherness to dwelling with his people was to be treated. And here comes Uzzah. In what appears to be an act of innocence, what appears to be an act of goodness, to reach out and to prevent, because the ox cart stumbles or hits an uneven part of the ground on the threshing floor, and the box tilts, and Uzzah reaches out to stabilize the ark. And God's anger is aroused, and Uzzah is killed instantly. Even David's response is that he's angry. And we might say, gee, what kind of God is this? Our family, over Christmas time, we like to watch certain films, movies. One of our favorites is Elf. Okay? And so there are lines that bounce around our home throughout the Christmas season, usually quotations from Elf. Like, you sit on a throne of lies, you smell like beef and cheese, or whatever. And so, but there's one scene in Elf where Buddy comes into his father's office, who they've had difficulty coming up with ideas for a new book. And so they bring in the expert, Miles. Some of you are saying, yeah, I remember that scene. And as Buddy comes in, he looks at the end of the table, he goes, oh! Miles is a little person. That Buddy says, oh, you have an elf with you. Miles takes great exception to that. And Buddy persists, and finally, Miles says, if you do that one more time, that thing, it's like, ooh, he's an angry elf. Miles comes flying, and he goes, look, he must be a South Pole elf. Well, sometimes that's how we view God, see, here in the Old Testament. Man, this is an angry God. I don't like this God. Not like the one in the New Testament who seems to be more loving. This God, he must be like the South Pole God. Jesus is the North Pole one. But sometimes that's how we treat this anger of God, because Uzzah was doing something that seemingly is so innocent, and God kills him. That is not an act of love. It is an act of holiness. You see, Uzzah died for his irreverence. That irreverence is he lost his perspective on the otherness of God. He profaned the name, the box is known as the name, the Holy One of God. What's going on is certainly some measure of expediency or pragmatism. I mean, what was the best way to get the ark to Jerusalem? What was the best way to do? Well, put it on an ox cart and carry it there. I mean, surely God wants the box in Jerusalem. Expediency or pragmatism does not supersede God's order of other. Good intentions in and of themselves do not override the moral code of God. You know, when you start to extrapolate this out, there are experiences in our life and in the lives of others that sometimes seem totally unjust, seem harsh, that cause us to question the goodness or the love of God or the moral integrity of God. Why does that happen? Is it because they're sinful? No. Is it because they were just? No. Well, why? They're innocent. Why does this happen? When those things happen to us in our life and in the lives of those we love, we need to come back to that Isaiah 57:15 passage, see? Because I only quoted half of it. Thus says the high and exalted one, whose name is holy, who inhabits eternity. But I also dwell with the lowly and the contrite of heart. When there are things that don't make sense to us, when we are judging by our sense of right and wrong, when we are judging by where we stand in time, very limited, finitely, when we sit and pass judgment on God, saying, God, this isn't the way I would do this, I would do it another way. What Isaiah says, no, you need to step back and submit yourselves humbly to what God is doing. To experience his presence, submitting to his otherness. He may not do what I would do. Thank goodness for that. But his otherness gives him the right to do that. But it's always perfect. Because it's still attached to his love. It's still attached to his goodness. It's still attached to his perfect justice and righteousness. R.C. Sproul went to be with the Lord this past year. Certainly wrote numerous works and spoke in a variety all over. I would venture to say that probably the one work, the one book and series of lectures of R.C. Sproul that has had the most significant impact in the Christian world was his book and his lecture series on the holiness of God. If you've never read that, or if you've never watched that video series, let me highly encourage you to do that. In his book, he cites a German scholar. He talks about a German scholar, Rudolf Otto, who in the 20th century attempted to do a study on the holy, but attempted to do it scientifically. And so what Otto did is he looked at people's around the world and said, how do they respond when confronted with whatever they consider holy? Well, whatever objects or God or person is holy, how do people respond to that? And as a result of that, he coined an expression in Latin, but it's mysterium tremendum, which essentially means awful mystery. That the response of people was a sense of awe, awfulness at the mystery of the other. Sproul says this: in Otto's study of the human experience of the holy, he discovered that the clearest sensation that human beings have when they experience the holy is an overpowering and overwhelming sense of creatureliness. That is, when we are aware of the presence of God, we become most aware of ourselves as creatures. When we meet the absolute, we know immediately that we are not absolute. When we meet the infinite, we become acutely conscious that we are finite. When we meet the eternal, we know we are temporal. To meet God is a powerful study in contrasts. Contrasts because God is the other. He's not like us. And so when I come to passages with moral dilemma, and I try to make sense of them by my determination of morality, I run into difficulties because it must be understood in light of the otherness of God. And that's how you respond to those experiences in life. A couple of years ago, Barb and I had the privilege of going into a little house in a little town in the middle of England. The town was Olney, and the house was owned by a poet. And we got to tour the house and his gardens. This poet suffered immensely with mental illness. Did some things, carried on some things in his life that it's like, this makes no sense at all. This is not what normal people do. He actually had tried to commit suicide 3 times. The vicar of Olney was a fellow by the name of John Newton, who spent a lot of time with William Cowper and mentored him over a number of years. Cowper wrote a number of hymns, lyrics to hymns that are part of the Olney hymnal. One of those has become just a deep favorite of mine. And I think it speaks to this. Certainly speaks in many ways about William Cowper. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and he rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. For behind that frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. when things don't make sense, where it seems that, God, this isn't what I signed up for. Remember who you're dealing with. One who is not like you, but one who is perfect in all his ways.